Namaste, welcome back. Let's start another important lecture or a lecture series of on Indigenous Knowledge Systems from the Earth for the Future. This is the 39th lecture of a lecture series. Today, I will discuss on intellectual property rights and ethical consideration. If we remember in the last class, in the last lecture, we discussed about efforts for preservation and promotion of indigenous knowledge. In the last, we discussed about the several key factors like documentation and archiving, intergenerational transmission, community-led research and partnership, cultural revitalization and language preservation, legal recognition of indigenous rights, education and capacity building, awareness raising and advocacy, at last ethical guidance and benefit sharing. Now, let's start discussing about intellectual property rights and ethical consideration. In the last lecture, we clearly discussed so many detailed factors for preservation and promotion. If you have missed, then you can see the link given over here. Not only that, there are a series of other lectures, like this is the 39th one. If you missed the earlier 38th, all the other, any one of them or either, then you can see or go through the link or go through the several other features, several other ways to get the knowledge about the indigenous knowledge system. So hit that like button and subscribe for more important anthropological lecture. Now let's start discussing about intellectual property right and ethical consideration. Today we'll highlight the issues like recognition of indigenous right, prior information consent, benefit sharing and fair trade, intellectual property protection, customary law and traditional governance, ethical guidelines and code of conduct. These are the 6 points that we try to highlight in order to defend, define and provide appropriate information about intellectual property right and ethical consideration, especially from the indigenous knowledge system point of view. Now let's start one by one. As I told you, intellectual property right and ethical consideration are central issues in the context of indigenous knowledge system, as they involve question of ownership, question of control and benefit sharing related to traditional knowledge, related to cultural expression, related to genetic resources. So addressing these issues require balancing the protection of indigenous rights, cultural heritage and knowledge sovereignty with the principle of equity, justice and respect for cultural diversity. Now let's discuss of intellectual property right and ethical consideration concerning indigenous knowledge system in a sequential manner, one by one. The first one, what I told you, is recognition of indigenous right. Indigenous rights are indigenous people have a collective right to their traditional knowledge, to their cultural expression, to their genetic resources, which are enshrined in international agreement such as UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous People, and the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. So recognizing and upholding indigenous right to self-determination, cultural integrity and control over their resources is essential for safeguarding indigenous knowledge and promoting cultural autonomy. Next important point is prior information consent, very important one, PIC. For anthropologists, it is very important to have this particular format. So prior informed consent is a fundamental principle in ethical engagement with indigenous knowledge system, requiring researcher, policymaker and commercial entities to obtain consent from indigenous community before assessing, before using or before disseminating their traditional knowledge or genetic resources. So PIC ensure that indigenous people have a right to make informed decision about how their knowledge is shared, how it is used and commercialized, and their cultural protocol and value are respected throughout the process. Third important point is benefit sharing and fair trade. Recognizing the contribution of indigenous communities to research, to conservation and sustainable development through benefit sharing mechanisms ensure that they receive equitable benefit, recognition and compensation for the use of their traditional knowledge and resources. So fair trade practices, community-based enterprises and mutual agreed benefit sharing arrangements can provide economic opportunities, support cultural revitalization and promote self-determination within indigenous community. Fourth important point is intellectual property protection. Indigenous knowledge holder may seek intellectual property protection for their traditional knowledge and cultural expression through various mechanisms, including patent, trademarks, copyright, and sui generis systems tailored to indigenous needs. However, conventional intellectual property framework may not always be appropriate or accessible for protecting indigenous knowledge, as they may conflict with indigenous value of collective ownership, communal stewardship, and non-commercialization. Fifth important point is customary law and traditional governance. Indigenous community often rely on customary law, traditional governance system, and community protocol to regulate access to their knowledge, protect sacred sites, and enforce cultural protocol. So recognizing and respecting indigenous legal system, customary norms, and governance structure is essential for ensuring that indigenous community have the authority to control and manage their knowledge resources according to their own value and priorities. Last important point is ethical guidelines and code of conduct. So developing ethical guidelines and code of conduct and best practices for researcher, policymaker, industrialist, industry stakeholder. It involved in working with indigenous knowledge system that help or ensure that ethical practice principles such as respect, reciprocity, and cultural sensitivity are upheld throughout the research process. Ethical guidelines should prioritize meaningful engagement with indigenous communities, monitored or informed consent, confidentiality, data sovereignty, and benefit sharing arrangement that benefit indigenous knowledge holder. So overall, we may say that all the key factor, either it is a priority informed consent, or it is recognition of indigenous knowledge, or it is benefit sharing or fair trade, or it is intellectual property protection, or customary law and traditional governance, or it is ethical guidance and code of conduct. So overall, addressing intellectual property right and ethical consideration concerning the indigenous knowledge system require a holistic, participatory, and culturally sensitive approach that respect indigenous rights, that respect indigenous value, that respect the world view by promoting equitable partnership, that by promoting mutual respect, by promoting cultural autonomy, we can support the preservation, revitalization, and responsible use of indigenous knowledge for the benefit of indigenous community, for the benefit of humanity, or for the benefit of humanity as a whole. So that's all for today. Now, another important information I just want to highlight it over here is that if you have any doubt, any queries, any questions related to either the present lecture or any of the earlier lecture concern, then you can ask through the comment section. Remember, every day around 1 p.m. you will get a new video that will increase the horizon of your understanding related to indigenous knowledge system or anthropology as a whole. So keep your notification bell on. Thank you so much. Namaste.